Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Dear viewers and listeners, as you know, every week you have the pleasure of listening to me comment on the theme of the day, but I do believe that variety is the spice of life, and therefore today we're going to do something different. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome as my special guest today, Paul Taylor, who like me is a senior fellow at Friends of Europe and who has a distinguished background and career in journalism as the diplomatic editor of the Reuters news agency and now more recently a columnist for Politico. And I do very much advise you to look at his weekly or bi-monthly columns on EU and international issues. Now, the reason I've invited Paul to join me today is because he's just published on behalf of Friends of Europe his latest report, this time dedicated to the Black Sea. And as we are all keeping an eye on the geopolitical situation vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia at the moment, and Paul has many interesting things to say in his report about the Black Sea and the broader issue of relations between Ukraine, Russia and the West, I thought that what we would do today would be that I would ask the questions and Paul can tell us what's in his report and how he thinks the Western diplomacy can de-escalate the current crisis with Russia. So Paul, welcome to Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. And as somebody who's written a number of reports for Friends of Europe on the Arctic, on the Eastern Mediterranean, on countries like the UK, Germany, Poland or France. Why did you choose to do your latest report on the Black Sea? What piqued your curiosity?
Well, Jamie, I think that this is, thank you for the invitation. I think that in some ways it's a more dangerous area than the Baltic or the Arctic. There are more disputes, frozen and non-frozen conflicts there. And of course, since Russia seized and annexed Crimea in 2014, we've actually got the occupation of the territory of another state in Europe for the first time since the end of World War II in Europe. So I think that, the other reason is that it struck me that the West's eye had been off the geopolitical ball in this region. It's not been the primary focus of the EU or NATO. It's sort of been under their radar screen in some ways. And neither organization really has a comprehensive strategy for stabilizing the Black Sea. NATO, I think, in addition, contributed to these problems, although it's not the sole responsible, by making a promise to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008 of future membership at some unspecified date with no path to get there, which aroused, Russian anger and fears without actually doing anything to improve the security of Ukraine and Georgia. So that's why I got interested, and that's the background to the situation I've been studying.
Paul, what do you think are Russia's strategic objectives in the Black Sea? I know that officials in NATO sometimes have the impression that Russia wants to turn the Black Sea into its sort of Mare Nostrum, our sea or a Russian lake. Is this true? And is Russia really prepared to risk a military confrontation in the Black Sea?
Well, that of course is the 64,000 euro question, and I don't have a crystal ball, but I think clearly what Russia's primary objectives are to secure its own security by creating and maintaining a buffer zone around it. It wants to keep NATO, in particular the United States, out of its near abroad. It doesn't want the Black Sea to become a NATO lake. And in fact, if you look at the map of the Black Sea from the north instead of the south, as we tend to in our atlases, you'll see that little by little, Bulgaria and Romania have become members of NATO. Turkey is a member of NATO, and Georgia and Ukraine both aspire to NATO membership. So in Russian eyes, the Black Sea was in danger of becoming a NATO lake with a Turkish choke point to constrain Russian power. Russia has countered that mainly by building up a large military fortress in Crimea since it seized Crimea, which it has used then to project power beyond the Black Sea, in particular to the Eastern Mediterranean and to North Africa. It used the Crimean basis extensively during its offensive in Syria in support of the Assad government there. So I think there's an attempt to create or to recreate a Russian sphere of influence, not just in Eastern Europe, but in Central Asia and the Caucasus. There's a desire to demonstrate Russia's continuing military power and relevance of power, and keep the United States' attention at the time when Washington was pivoting towards Asia and seeing China as its main challenger. And then I think there's a desire to keep Russia's neighbors weak and off balance in order to avoid any democratic contagion, as it were, from the color revolutions that have taken place in countries such as Georgia and Ukraine, pro-Western, pro-European revolutions that are inconvenient for Moscow.
Well, thanks. And it's always interesting, as you rightly point out, to see things through the other side of the telescope. But NATO has two big partner countries in the shape of Ukraine and Georgia, both Black Sea countries. Do you sense from your interviews and preparing the report that Ukraine and Georgia think they're getting enough support from NATO in the Black Sea to keep it open for their commercial traffic and trade and so on?
I don't think they feel that they're getting all of the support that they would like, and in particular, they're very, very focused on membership of NATO. Even though the reality is that that's not going to happen, in my view, in the next decade, possibly not in my lifetime, because it's a bridge too far for NATO, I think. But NATO, having made this promise to these countries, is having to create lots of intermediate steps on the way to membership in order to give these countries more help and support where it can. It's doing some of the right things in terms of increasing its policing in the Black Sea, in terms of participating in joint exercises. Individual NATO allies are involved in training. NATO is doing some officer training for both these countries. But also in providing defensive equipment for them, and in sharing intelligence. And these are things which NATO can do to help friendly countries without membership. But I think that, in my view, the political focus in both Ukraine and Georgia has been too much on membership, which is actually a very distant prospect, and too little on what can we do for ourselves now to make ourselves more indigestible to Russia.
Yeah, okay, that's a clear message. Paul, inevitably we're under time constraints, and there are two further things I want to ask you, so let's try to squeeze them in. The first thing is Turkey. It seems to be sometimes in a rather sort of ambivalent position, member of NATO, but good relations with Russia, but also a major supplier of weapons to Ukraine, and of course a big Black Sea power. So briefly, where do you think Turkey stands in the present crisis?
I think Turkey wants to try and keep the Black Sea quiet. It's been the region, the part of its borders that is the least troublesome compared to the East Mediterranean, where there are disputes with Cyprus and Greece, Syria, where there's Kurdish fighters on the border, Iraq and Iran also potentially difficult neighbors. So Turkey wants to have just enough NATO in the Black Sea so as to feel safe, but it's basically comfortable with a sort of Turkish-Russian condominium. Turkey's also offered mediation. Whether that leads to anything, we'll see, but it's obviously one of the possible ladders that President Putin could use to climb down if he chooses not to use military force.
Okay, Paul, final question then, and we'll squeeze this in because it is the big question at the end. NATO has been deploying forces, or at least talking about deploying additional forces to the Baltic region, the Black Sea region, as a deterrence to Russia. It's been meeting the Russians, of course. The US, the Europeans are trying the diplomatic track very hard at the moment to persuade Putin to climb down. Do you think these efforts are going to be successful at the end of of the day, or are you increasingly pessimistic that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is now inevitable?
I don't think it's inevitable. I don't really see how it makes sense for Russia. I think Russia would pay a very high price and would find Ukraine very hard to actually occupy if it were to, probably relatively easy to conquer but difficult to hold. So I think that for those reasons, I don't think it's inevitable, and I do think that the diplomatic track can work. But it will require, in my view, some acknowledgement, and it may be private and it may be at presidential level, some acknowledgement that NATO is not about to admit Ukraine and Georgia. And while it cannot withdraw the promise it made, this is a long-term perspective and would be in a different Europe with a different security organization.
Paul Taylor, thank you very much. Sorry we didn't have more time, but your points came across clearly. It was great to share the platform with a different voice. So, dear audience, dear viewers, I hope you enjoyed the new format as well, even if next week you may have to put up with me once again. Bye for now.